Good evening, everyone. It is May 10th. We're here for a work session of the City Council on the budget this evening. We're going to go ahead and get started with public comment on non-agenda items. Any members of the public wishing to speak to the council can go ahead and come forward or raise your hand if you are on Zoom. And City Clerk, I am not on the Zoom meeting just yet, so if you see anybody.
I see no one, Mayor.
Okay, thank you, City Clerk. We'll go ahead and close that public comment period. Move on to the work session on the supplemental budget. City Manager.
Nancy, do we have Jen in this books by Zoom?
Jen's here.
Oh, you're right.
Jen's here.
She can zoom in too.
This is starting out really well. Okay, good.
City Manager can only go up from here.
Right. That's getting worse, huh? Okay. All right, well, I wanted to start off by recognizing these fine people who were apparently invisible. You know our Administrative Services Director, Jennifer Wade, and of course we also have our lead accountant, Louise Johnson, and our accountant, Spencer Katuri, here. And I just wanted them to join us this evening as we start off, just to let you know, these guys do so much of this work right here. They put this entire document together that you have in front of you, some couple hundred pages, I think, this year, folks. So, and of course, I have to say, the document is just a front-facing publication. What goes into getting to that point is a tremendous amount of work. This team's done a great job this year, and I just wanted to thank them, and I asked them to be here as we started off to receive some accolades. So thank you very much, Louise, Jen, and Spencer. I appreciate it. We're going to start off this evening. Do you want to say anything, Jennifer? Okay. We're going to start off this evening with the agenda that was published for you. I did include some page number references, and I think the good news for all of you is that you don't have to tonight expect to cover all 270 pages of this document. We're going to hit highlights. How we'll handle this, because this is the second year of a fiscal biennium. So this budget for fiscal 24 starting July 1 really was adopted last year by the City Council. What you're looking at tonight is just reviewing some pretty minor recommendations for modifying that second year fiscal 24 budget. I'm going to start with my transmittal letter, or my message, which is page 4 of the document, and I just want to drill down a little bit there. What I try to always do for you in that transmittal letter is hit the high points, and particularly in the second year of the budget. And as you'll see, there are really 3 notable high points that I reference here. This budget, like every year, but especially in the last probably 3 to 4 years, makes really significant investments into capital construction. Our community is growing, and so we are continuing money and funding for large projects that you are familiar with, like the Northside Tank and Transmission Project, and also the Wyoming Avenue storm sewer water and street improvements up there. So we'll talk about capital in the general fund and the capital construction fund this evening, and we'll go over those projects in more detail, so I'll skip past that. But the second really notable area that I addressed in the message here was our planning ahead for compensation and staffing study to occur in this second year of the biennium, or excuse me, in the first year of the biennium, so that we could presumably make adjustments to compensation and staffing in year 2. We're going to talk in more detail about that as well, and we have Human Resources Director Patty Russell here. She's going to back me on presenting some information to you later on from our workforce report and updating you on the status of our classification and compensation study. And then Chief Johnson is really, of all of the changes that are being made in the realm of personnel in the second year of the biennium. They're most notable in Chief Johnson's office, and so he's going to help me with some presentation there. What you should know is there are no major changes to compensation and staffing yet suggested for fiscal 24 because we're a little bit behind in getting our analysis done. So we expect we will be implementing those changes in the fall once we get the compensation study, and when it comes to the staffing study, we won't have that data till likely late fall, winter, and so that will become data feeding into next biennium. So those are kind of the highlights there. And now I want to talk to you about the structure for tonight. So our intention this evening is to go through general fund, capital construction fund, and recreation center fund. These are our tax-funded, largely tax-funded functions, with the exception of recreation center, of course, which also has a significant amount of funding from membership fees. How we'll handle this is Jennifer will talk you through just a general financial position statement for each of those three major tax-funded activities. And then I'll cover the supplemental recommendations that I've made for you, and that'll be kind of the structure for each of those approaches. You should know I did take general fund, and when we get to the capital fleet and equipment section, I just added the capital construction fund there, because as you know, the capital construction fund is just where we budget for really big projects like the one I just mentioned, Northside Tank, that are going to occur over many years, 4 or 5 years from start to finish. And so we put them into that capital construction fund, but we'll cover that as part of general fund, even though it technically isn't. So with that, I think I would allow Jennifer to come up and talk to you about financial position in the general fund. And those page number references, Council, are page 20 to 23.
Thank you, City Manager. Welcome, Director Wade. Appreciate you being here.
Happy to be here. Honorable Mayor and City Councilors, as you know, budget season is my favorite season of the year. And so we get to talk about some of my favorite stuff, and hopefully we present this narrative to you in a compelling way so that you can understand it, because that's what real transparency means. So we'll launch right into a discussion of the general fund's financial position after I just speak to you very briefly about the idea of a government fund. And I do this for some of our newer council members or for members of the public who might be joining us this evening. And so, as many of you know, we actually can't talk about government finances without talking about the concept of a fund. Every government has them. We throw the word around a lot, but what actually are these funds? Think of our government as an umbrella under which different activities occur, different operations occur. And these funds are really separate financial and accounting operations that are created to serve a specific purpose. Tonight, we're going to journey through the general fund and the recreation center fund, which are types of governmental funds. The general fund, by its definition, is a fund that accounts for every activity that can't be accounted for in any other fund, which creates this catch-all effect, literally, and can create some real tension when you're making decisions about resource allocation. The city's general fund, in particular, services our police, our fire, our parks and recreation, our code administration and enforcement, planning, streets operations, administrative operations. So a lot of the services that the public thinks about when it thinks about our city services are actually funded in the general fund. Whereas the Recreation Center Fund is a special revenue fund, which means that revenue generated by that fund is really intended to support that operation. But as a governmental fund, it can actually receive support from other governmental funds. And so you'll see the general fund transfer come up as a topic of discussion when we get to the Recreation Center Fund financial position topic. At next week's budget work session, we're going to review financial position and activities in our enterprise or business type funds. And so as many as you know, those are our water, our wastewater, and sewer operations. And those funds function most similarly to a private corporation, in that they are self-supporting, and they also operate primarily on exchange transactions, which means that we provide a service in return for a fee. And make no mistake, those funds do receive intergovernmental revenue sources in the forms of grants and loans for infrastructure, but by and large, most of the revenue in those funds, the sustainable revenue, actually comes from user fees. And so with that, if there are no questions about the fund structure for Laramie, I'll move on to general fund financial position.
Council members, any questions? Okay, great.
Okay, I'm happy to report that the financial condition of the general fund is stable. And I would say for a long time, the financial condition of the general fund was stable, but barely getting by. And I would say it is stable and getting by with a lot of good planning these days, primarily because of some internally generated as well as externally generated revenue enhancements that have happened since fiscal year 2017. And so really analysis of sustainability happened in the general fund starting long-term in fiscal year 2017 when the city manager led a series of budget reductions that aligned operating expenses and operating revenue sources. And in Laramie, for the past 6 or 7 years, we actually have not considered the direct distribution an operating revenue source because we did not deem it reliable based on, frankly, signaling from the state that we shouldn't. And so in 2017, there were budget reductions put into place that actually dialed back our expenses. In the years that followed, there have been enhancements in revenue that have made that revenue base more favorable to funding government operations in the general fund. In particular, continued voter support of the 5th penny optional tax has been critical to continuing providing those services, without which we actually would have to dial back our services in the general fund. Voter support for the 6th penny in 2018, and a 6th penny that actually supported entirely governmental operations. So think streets, parks and recreation, trails. That was really impactful to the general fund, as well as Enrolled Act 23 in the 2019 general session that expanded the taxation of online sales. And so those things in combination have really made general fund revenue much healthier than it has been historically at the city of Laramie, and we'll look at some graphs that really illustrate that point later on. I would also note that the general fund benefited greatly from pandemic-related federal aid in the form of CARES Act funding and state and local fiscal recovery funds. And so the revenue replacement allocation that the council made to the general fund was about $1.6 million of that allocation, while the other $4 million went to support our enterprise operations and in particular infrastructure projects. And so all in all, if we're looking historically, revenue in the general fund does look much healthier. In the sections that follow, I'm going to take you through an overview of the 2022 results. That's our most recently completed fiscal year, give you my projections for 2023, and talk to you about the sustainability that I feel is implicit in the city manager's recommendation for 2024. So in 2022, what we really saw is what I'm coining a return to normal, because we've used that term a lot in the pandemic recovery phase. If you look at revenue in the general fund in 2020 and 2021, we had growing sales and use tax because of the expanded taxation of online sales, but in a pandemic environment where some of our sectors were really suffering. And so, thank goodness people were online shopping, because that really helped Laramie during those times. But we had sectors that were hard hit, like accommodation and food services. And so even with sales and use tax, it was difficult to plan. In 2021, we had some one-time collections in sales and use tax related to wind energy development. So we were seeing spikes that made projecting difficult for what is one of our core resource types. Also in expenses in 20 and 21, really unique environment. The city manager implemented wisely a spending freeze at the beginning of the pandemic because no one was sure what was going to happen, which means expenses in 2020 were understated compared to normal. And in 2021, we all remember the Great Resignation. I'd like to not go through that again. And so our staffing costs really reduced. And so in 2022, you see us providing quite normal cost of living adjustments or merit-based increases to people based on the city manager's recommendation, but you see less attrition. And so you see those expenditures coming back to what I feel is a more normal level too. And so 2022 was a good year in terms of creating a new baseline, a new benchmark for financial forecasting, because we really didn't have that in 20 and 21. And what we see in terms of sustainability based on results in 22 is we still have structural balance without relying on the direct distribution. And the chart at the bottom of page 21 really illustrates this. And so you'll see that operating revenue still exceeds operating expenses by about $0.6 million. So that's great news for the general fund's financial condition.
Please, yeah. Go ahead.
Just to clarify, you always mean fiscal year when you say 21 or 22. You always mean the fiscal year. And for the public, that would be July. So fiscal year, we're in fiscal year 23, which started in July of 22. Just wanted to make sure I was clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor.
Honorable Mayor, through you, thank you, Councilmember O'Doherty. That is an excellent point. Yes. So the chart at the top of page 22 actually illustrates total revenue and total expenditures in relation to one another in the general fund. What you'll see in 22 is that we actually did spend a little bit more than we took in, but that was actually planned as we were using some built-up reserves for capital initiatives. So all in all, 22 was a great year. Looking at 2023, revenue and sales and use tax in particular is still very healthy for Laramie. At the date of the publication of this document, it had increased 9% compared to the prior fiscal year to date. Now, there are some one-time collections in that number related to hydroelectric development, and so it's hard to tell what those one-time collections, sometimes what percent is going to be ongoing. We haven't quite dived into those details yet. We will do so. We're hoping 5% is actually sustainable growth. In expenses, we are experiencing the same pressures as any other employer, and that it is hard to recruit people with an outdated pay plan, and we are having to pay a little bit more for personnel services than we have had to pay in the past. We also are looking at an environment this year with a 13% increase in health insurance cost. So it's putting a lot of pressure on all city funds, but the general fund in particular, because of how much of its budget is actually related to personnel services. And so expenditures are going up in 2023 as well as revenue, but I'm not sure they're offsetting each other. And so in my projection for 2023 is that we will maintain structural balance, which means we're not going to rely on the direct distribution only by a thin margin if we do. And this may be the first year in a long time where we actually start strategically using a portion of that direct distribution, as well as setting aside some additional reserves to kind of hedge against some growth we know needs to happen in expenses in order to be competitive, in order to implement some of the recommendations of the staffing and compensation analysis, which I know that the city manager and the HR director will talk about more later. And so 2023 will end well, but a little thinner margins than we're used to. Now in 2024, in our budget planning processes, what we focused on a lot with the budget team and with the city manager is what amount of growth and our operating expenses in the general fund do we actually feel is sustainable, because that really should influence the amount that the city manager recommends for the reserve for the implementation of the staffing and compensation analysis. And I'm happy to report that the budget team spent a lot of time on those conversations, and the number we settled on in every fund was a number that we felt was conservative without being unnecessarily conservative, and was a number that we could commit to in the long run. And just as a finance professional, I am grateful to work with a city manager that actually prioritizes financial sustainability, because that isn't always the case. That isn't a given. And so the numbers you see before you in the recommendation this evening were very much governed by this idea of maximum growth that we felt we could support with our revenue sources. We are unsure now if we can rely on an ongoing 3% or 5% increase in sales and use tax collections. That's what we'll be really looking for in the coming year, is where we want to settle. 5% is pretty favorable to us. 3% is a little bit tighter, and so we'll be analyzing that more in the coming year. But I am happy to report that what you see before you, while we will start to use some of that direct distribution, we are projecting that will be in the short term, while we're maybe growing a little bit in advance and letting sales and use tax revenue catch up over the next few years, and as we're still figuring out what we can rely on for trends in that revenue source. On page 23, you'll notice a graph that displays our trends in fund balance reserves. And so you'll notice we have a buildup in reserves in 2021 and 22 for reasons I just described, which is why we are able to set aside some additional reserves as contingency funds for some growth that we need to do in our operations. The next few pages of your budget document, meaning pages 24 to page 31, describe major sources of general fund revenue. While I will not go over these sources of revenue this evening, this is a fairly short section of the budget document where interested users could learn a lot about what the resources in the general fund actually look like. So this is a section you may want to come back to. You might want to circle some charts we talk about tonight and really note sections of interest. I will lead you through a few graphs that I feel are illustrative.
Councilor Pierce?
Yeah, thanks. Is it okay to bump in while you're Yeah, all right.
It's okay with me, so long as,
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Jen, you mentioned the unassigned reserves. Can you tell me, I recall like 6 months being a good number, and we got a little nervous when we were in the 4-month range, and now we're in the 8-month range, which is really exciting, right? Right? So so that's good. But is 6 kind of our target number?
Honorable Mayor, through you, our policy says 3 to 6 months, and so 6 months would be on the high end.
Okay.
And so when you see 8 months, in addition to the graph above it, that kind of shows you why we're able to say, yeah, we're just going to use some of these reserves as buffer against things we are not aware of right now, in order to do some of the things we need to do with the staffing and compensation study. Yeah. On page 24, there are a couple of charts I'd like to point out. The first one is in the first column. You'll notice that 80% of the revenue sources in the general fund are from intergovernmental sources. And these are sources that the city doesn't control. They're state shared revenue sources, perhaps sources like the fifth penny that voters have to approve, grants. So in general, sources of revenue that we don't just run out and increase rates for if we need additional resources. And this composition of revenue creates the funding pressure in the general fund, as well as the sheer volume of the services that we're trying to fund. Now, of that intergovernmental total, 53% is from sales and use tax revenue, and 15% is from the direct distribution. So combined, that makes 70% of our intergovernmental revenue total. And that's one of the reasons you hear us talking about those revenue sources so much. We want to focus on material items that make a difference, and those sources of revenue are very important to general fund operations. The graph at the bottom of page 24 provides a nice graphic illustration of the change in sales and use tax revenue that we've seen in the past decade, well, actually more than a decade, since 2009. I'd like to point out that you'll see between 2009 and 2017, those collections didn't change very much. So you're working with more or less a flat revenue source, a highly variable direct distribution to fund core government services, and that's where some of the historical challenges have come from, and I'm sure some of our new council members have heard about some of those challenges. It's because of this revenue dynamic in the general fund, and this graph, I feel, shows it best. Also on page 26, I'd like to point out the graph at the bottom, which is a great representation of sales and use tax collections since 2013. And so you'll see again, those collections, like more or less it's the revenue being flat, and then all of a sudden they spike up in that pandemic environment, which is what I was describing to you earlier. What we consider our new normal for sales and use tax revenue to be for Laramie is around $14 million, which is significant for us. However, even with that significance, we are still in the bottom 4 in the state for per capita sales and use tax collections. And so I just want to point that out. And so even though things are really good for us, we still are kind of lower tier in the state in terms of how much of that revenue source we bring in. Pages 28 and 29 provide a nice overview of the direct distribution, including some nods to changes in that formula over time that have reduced Laramie's distribution. I'm not going to go over that in detail, but I would encourage users to read it. I would also like to note that because this year the legislature passed an additional $34 million in local government distributions, Laramie's direct distribution will go from $3.7 million, which was originally forecasted, to $6.2 million. And what we plan to do with these additional resources is also hold them in reserve for a while, at least until we get that staffing and compensation analysis in hand and have some great discussions about long-term sustainability until we really know if they're available or not. And so right now there are no additional appropriations recommended for that additional revenue source. I would imagine that would be forthcoming in the future. I think those are all the major revenue sources that we need to spend time covering tonight, but there's some really interesting material in that section of the budget book, and again, I would encourage you to spend time there. We'll move along to the forecasted revenue fund. adjustment to revenue. Most of that adjustment is in 3 categories. There's a $2.1 million adjustment to sales and use tax revenue for reasons we've already discussed, moving our forecast to next year for $13.9 million. I believe the amount that WAM recommends in their budget handbook is $14 million, so we're right in line with that. The reason we're a little bit more conservative is that we are aware that there are one-time collections from this year in our fiscal year 2023 total, and so we're just forecasting that a little bit more conservatively for that reason. We are also changing the forecast for the direct distribution by $2.4 million, and we are reappropriating lease purchase financing proceeds of $2.2 million to match the timing of delivery of fleet items, which, as you all know, continue to experience delivery delays. And that wraps up my presentation of the general fund's financial position and revenue. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Director Wade. Council members, any questions on the funds? Councilor Doherty.
So if the wind farm gets going, will that come into the minerals and royalties? Or does it come in somewhere else? If the wind farm revenue for the county, will we see a change is what I'm trying to figure out, and where would it be?
Honorable Mayor, through you, we could see potentially some impact assistance funding, and we could see some sales and use tax collections depending on that development. Yes.
Councilor Gabriel, and then to you, Councilor Pierce.
Thanks, Mayor. Jen, tell me where the CARES Act funding is right now. Have we spent all of it? Is it somewhat committed to something, or where does that stand?
Council Member Gabriel, we spent the CARES Act funding, I believe, 2 fiscal years ago. And so our most significant applications, if I'm remembering right, were for public safety payroll. And so they were more or less reimbursements. And then with the additional resources, we were able to backfill some of the increased funding needs in the recreation center, because we've invested about an extra $2.5 million in the recreation center over the last few years due to the pandemic recovery. And so CARES Act is entirely expended, as well as the state and local fiscal recovery funds that were allocated in the general fund. And so there's no more revenue coming, and there's none in reserve from those initiatives. Yeah.
Councilor Pierce.
Yeah, thank you. I'm on page, let's see where I am, 29, and it has a sample of communities related to the direct distribution. And in years past, I've seen all the communities is there a possibility of getting all the communities in terms of this particular chart that we have here? And then I'm also wondering, in terms of like our community, unlike other communities, had the like the pension A, right? Am I remembering the number? Was it A or B? In this calculation on page 29, is that in there, or is that an additional subtraction? So, okay.
Yeah. Council Member Pierce, the pension A actually doesn't have anything to do with the distribution formulas at all. I believe what it says in the pension A legislation is that they will take it from this if we do not pay, but it actually does not influence the distribution. The distribution has been more impacted by the variability in sales and use tax collections across Wyoming counties, as well as the census population from 2020, and that's really what this chart is intended to illustrate, is how communities that have generally more resources in the city of Laramie, because of the formula in effect and because of the census results, because that actually really compounded the issue, are receiving more distribution, where last year Laramie was forecasted to receive much less. And so I left this chart in here quite intentionally, even though we are receiving much more distribution this year, because this would be the reality if there were not a supplemental appropriation that was distributed with a hardship component, which is what we're seeing now.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, anyway, I was just thinking the -11 may have included an additional math behind with the pensionists.
No, this is
That
quite-
is like so sad.
And this is very much what we are looking at for 2023.
Right.
So it is in the current biennium. I want to make sure I understand, are you saying you'd like to see this for all communities or more, or?
All of the communities, because I was having a conversation with a representative from the state, and they're going to be working on the direct distribution, right? And I'm thinking, this would be a very handy document if it just showed, what's been for every community, so they have a point of reference from Laramie's perspective.
That information would be easy to pull together. I'm happy to do that for you.
I mean, not a super rush, but I know it's a topic, and I know we typically get stuff like that together anyway for when they ask, but that would be great.
City Manager, I would make sure to send that to you so you could distribute to the council.
Thank you.
Council members, any other questions?
Forgot mine.
I can't be the only council member that got a little more anxiety when Councilor Pierce said they're going to work on the direct distributions again. All right, seeing none, thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
I was thinking division was the answer. Yeah, it could be.
Computer's freaking out. Okay, that's better. Council, I noted that the page number reference on the agenda handout is not right, but I pulled the right numbers for you. So we're going to move now to page 37 in your workbook. This section begins discussion about expenditures. And this chart that is being displayed on the screen for you shows across the entirety of the general fund some history of actual spending from starting left to right. Fiscal 21 actual spending, fiscal 22 actual spending, the year-to-date actual for the current fiscal year as of April 1st, the budget for the current fiscal year, and then the adopted budget for the upcoming fiscal 24 as it was adopted by you last June. The second from right column that says fiscal 24 adjustment is what is being recommended to be modified from the adopted budget. And then that final column on the right that says fiscal 24 adjusted would be the entire budget newly adopted if you accept all of the recommended adjustments. So I'm not going to cover each of these, but I did want to highlight a couple. If you look in the fire department, you'll see some rather sizable numbers in that second from right column. One of those is in capital project studies and equipment. That's related to apparatus, and we'll get into a little more detail about that as we continue talking. Also, you'll note a significant personnel adjustment of $694,584 that I am recommending. We'll also talk about that in detail in a moment. Scrolling down, you also see in police and in parks and recreation some sizable adjustments, but again in capital projects, which accounts for the sizable nature of those recommendations. And then as we move to the top of page 38, again in that second from right-hand column and what is being recommended for adjustment, Public Works, you'll see a sizable number there, $3.568 million, again in capital projects. Some downward adjustments in administrative services that we'll talk about under personnel. So in total, the recommended adjustment is $10,730,635. Please note that that is not necessarily cash. A lot of that is grant, particularly as it pertains to our capital projects and also some grants related to personnel. Looking at the mid to bottom part of page 38, there's some useful charts here I thought I would touch on just to give you a sense overall of where the city spends its money for governmental services. And that pie chart, there it is, Nance. You can see here that the adjusted budget, when we look at it at a departmental level for fiscal 24 upcoming, this is how it would look, with about 43% of all spending being within our public safety, police, fire, EMS areas. Public Works, as is typical, comes in second at 18%, and then General Government 13%, and Parks and Recreation 11%. General Government and Parks and Rec often compete for those final two positions, depending on how much capital work the Parks and Recreation has funded out of the general fund. You'll see also in the adjusted expenditure chart next to the pie chart that our personnel expenditures or costs in any given year are very significant in the general fund. And this is hearkening back to what I said before, where we move multi-year capital projects out into that capital construction fund. So when you look at just the general fund, our personnel costs make up 54% of everything budgeted here. And then capital still comes in second at just under 10 million, but there are many, many, many more tens of millions in the capital construction fund that is kind of the companion fund to the general fund. If we move to page 39, you can see a little bit of a breakdown here in the upper left-hand page of what the recommended adjustments to fiscal '24 break out and how they look. $1 million of that, nearly $10 million, is an adjustment for capital transfers, so being moved over to support capital projects in another fund. And then rebudgeting, okay, so this is, if you look at the bottom where it says capital rebudgets, $7,327,627. Of that $10 million, $7.3 million is just being rebudgeted from the current year into the next year. So it's not, again, it's not new money. I know 10 million looks kind of scary. You're probably thinking, what are you telling us to do, city manager? But the truth is really only about 2.8 million, I think, if I remember the number, is actually adjustment to the total budget allocation. On this page, there's a discussion initiated about our personnel and our full-time equivalent positions. I'm going to touch on this, but I'm going to reserve to the end the discussion about fire, simply because we're going to do a deep dive, as I promised you last night. So you'll see at the right-hand side the chart that shows all full-time equivalent positions of the city. You'll see that from fiscal '24 to what the adjusted budget would look like, there would be an increase of 1.8 positions. That's a net across the entire fund. In fiscal '22, we did reduce positions by 1 full-time equivalent in the fire department for that community risk reduction position. In April of '22, the council approved an additional FTE for our engineering division. The intent there being that that position would help us ensure that we can kind of implement this big bolus of capital funding that you see working its way through our budget, and means a lot of work when you translate those dollars into actual work out in the field. I think I would offer to you, on the whole, the addition of that engineering position has been really beneficial and likely to continue well beyond just this biennium. I also wanted to, before we move off this page, I wanted to look at that bar chart with the blue and orange over there and point out to you, Jennifer had mentioned that our spending was down in fiscal '21 due to the spending freeze for COVID. And so you can see in that left-hand most bar chart, actual spending really being significantly low and just frankly barely above the year-to-date actual for the current year. So that was a scary time, and staff really adjusted and spent very little. And fortunately, revenue came in and showed that spending freeze was useful, but we probably didn't have to completely freeze spending, but you'd much rather do that than look back and see the picture looking the opposite way in your rearview mirror.
Yeah, go ahead, Councillor.
This was the question about the FTEs.
Yes, please.
As I recall, police, the dispatch, do they fall under police?
They do.
Fire, okay. So the whole emergency dispatch, all of those people are FTEs under police?
They are. They're in that 76 3/4, I think it is, yeah, in police.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. All right, if there are no questions on that, then we'll go to the next page where there's some detail about what we call them operating supplemental recommendations to you are. Starting at the top of page 40, I'm going to start with the first item there. In general administration, excuse me, I'm recommending a climate vulnerability and risk assessment. I've estimated $75,000 to complete this study. This would help us to try to assess and evaluate how changing weather patterns that are outside of that observed historical range might impact our utility systems. And the reason that matters, of course, is engineers design, for instance, stormwater systems and stormwater detention retention areas to those historically observed patterns of runoff. And so if we think that climate patterns may shift to some degree, that could influence a lot of work that we've done to try to read the tea leaves of the future. A lot of communities are conducting surveys of this sort to try to get ahead of what might be changing. The $75,000 I budgeted for this, I will tell you, it's largely a swag number. I don't know exactly what this is going to cost. It may have to come in two parts based on the research that I've done on this. And I'm actually going to a conference next week in Denver where I'll be sitting through like a little training on this. So I may come home with a lot better information than I have tonight.
Thank you, City Manager. Councilor Doherty.
For example, last year when we had that storm that it really hit certain parts of town really severely, I was thinking, how many million did you say that cost? And then how did you come up with that money?
You know, that's a great question, and I don't remember right now. I'd have to go back in my files, but there was an estimate there. And that didn't come from us. Let me clarify, that came from the county emergency management section. And they requested estimates of damage from private property owners as well as from public entities like ourselves. So I'd have to pull that data, but it was significant. And of course, that storm was different. It sort of hung below the ridge up here and kind of up on Harney and 30th to 22nd, and really just dumped water in a unique way. So, you know, is that a once in my lifetime storm, or is that something that we should continue to think is more likely to occur? What I will say is, in researching this, the federal government in the last 2 years have put out a huge body of work, actually already laying the groundwork for climate and weather pattern change predictions. It's actually very interesting if you go look at it. They've mapped out the entire country and done some really high-level analysis of how wind patterns, storm patterns could change. So there's something to build on out there, and frankly, I hope there might be some grant funding, but as yet I haven't seen anything specific to that. But typically when the feds will create that kind of body of data, you know, there's likely some money coming behind it to help communities prepare. The focus right now for the federal governments is on the coastal areas, right, where there's really a lot of concern about sea level change or saltwater infiltration into fresh water and things like that. But Mountain West shows that we will be probably more stable when you look at the federal data, and maybe less affected than coastal areas, but there's still some significant effects predicted by the federal data. So.
Thank you, City Manager.
You're welcome. We're going to talk about the second item next on that list later, the EMS best practice study. I wanted to point out also under general government, we did adjust down for LCBA, our Laramie Chamber Business Alliance agreement. And I feel like I want to kind of celebrate that, because our community partners, while we, I think in general, are happy to support them, LCBA has been on a mission to sort of take advantage of the fruit that has been born from the decisions the city made over the last 10 years to seed them with property and assets so that they could become a self-sufficient entity. And so, as you know, they did come to you this year requesting to reduce their allocation from the city council by $80,000. So I always like to point out when there's a sizable adjustment down in the budget, right? And particularly from a partner. So we're pleased to see that, and I think it means that our strategy of trying to help prop them up and make them self-sufficient is starting to pay off, so that's good. Moving down to police, the total adjustment recommended for that department is $49,600. Pretty minor in the scheme of things, but I did want to point out that the third item in their list, the Axon body-worn camera contract, we have seen the contract for data storage and equipment related to this go up a bit. We will be applying for potentially a small rural and tribal grant that could help support this request. And we have to increase the data retention and storage capacity for Axon body-worn camera footage with these funds. Very important to the overall operation. And I think also important to meet the expectations of the community for policing. Fire has a total operating supplemental about the same, $47,500. You'll see there's a sizable recommendation for uniforms to be replaced, and this is just a function of supply chain interruptions where delivery didn't come and is still pending on certain items, so it's just kind of coalescing into this upcoming budget. Moving to the next page, recommended adjustment in Public Works and Engineering of $14,940. In Recreation, adjustment of $17,000 for Freedom Has a Birthday. As you know, there used to be a community group that put this on. The city took over Freedom Has a Birthday a number of years ago, and so this is the $17,000 for that event. And then $11,500 in finance recommended, IT $15,000, and at the bottom of that page, looking in the HR section, a couple adjustments amounting to a total of $28,650, the majority of which would be for our employee assistant program in the second line. And we increased our employee assistance program with COVID, but we've seen that being very well utilized by our employees. That provides for 5 free mental health visits per year for each employee or their family. And this would allow us to correct that line item in the budget, which we knew was going to be overexpended temporarily, but it would allow us to correct it and then make permanent that 5 visit per year benefit for staff. Okay, those are operating supplementals, and we'll be moving next to capital. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I know those are small numbers, but I didn't want to overlook anything significant.
Council members, any questions? City Manager, I had one question regarding, because you mentioned the chamber and their fee-for-service, or the Laramie Chamber Business Alliance. Up on page, I think, 37, in the fee-for-service agreements section, the budget ends up being, sort of comparable to 2022, the adjusted budget, and I think it ends up $245,000. Why does that number stay the same in our budget or increase by $10,000 when we're seeing a drop in the? Am I missing one of our partners that
Right.
is receiving an increase, or are we leaving more money in the airport?
We did make significant larger investments in the airport this year, and I'm not sure exactly what line item you're referring to, but I think it's that one went down and the other went up, and so it's probably about the same.
Yeah, it's the fee-for-service agreements line towards the top of page 37.
Okay.
Under general government.
Right.
Yeah, right there in the middle between general government and the green bar. And so you'll see
Oh, I see it now. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, fiscal year 24 adjusted budget is $245,000, and the actuals for 22 are $235. And so I was trying to.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact amount for the airport, Mayor, but we do have the airport, Laramie Business Alliance, and also Main Street, all three on fee-for-service contracts. So I think the two just offset each other between the airport going up and LCBA going down.
Okay.
As I recall, I think Main Street stayed about the same.
Right.
Maybe 5,000 different. Do you recall, John? It was
about the same.
Yeah, I think
Okay,
so.
great, thank you. Any other questions, council, before we? Okay, thanks, City Manager.
You're welcome. Good catch, Seb. Okay, so going to page, and I'm not going to go to 77 quite yet. I hope you didn't go there. I'm sorry. I did note I wanted to mention a couple things on page 40. So we just looked at, or excuse me, not page 40, page 43. Those were operating supplementals we just talked about, but I did want to touch a little bit on the personnel adjustments that are being recommended. And note that we are recommending the decrease of a full-time position in the finance section at the top of that page. That was a position that we thought would be needed with respect to ERP, but now we have successfully recruited a finance manager to work with Jennifer and her staff, with Director Wade and her staff, and we think, and also some part-time support, so we believe that we can let go of that position that we thought we would need. I also want to point your attention to the next section, which is general government personnel. As we are looking at compensation this year for all staff and expecting results of that compensation study in the late summer, fall, it occurred to me that I have not traditionally, when we have looked at staff compensation, I've not also looked at council compensation. Don't know if you wanted me to, but I did. And we surveyed the communities around the state, and if I were your HR director, I think the HR director agrees, we would suggest that you may want to look at your own salaries in this upcoming year. So I took the liberty of recommending some adjustments to your budget here. You would have to implement those by ordinance. As you'll recall, it's been a long time since you've adjusted your salaries. But when we look at other communities around the state, we do think that they are lagging a little bit behind. And you have some statutory limitations on what you can be paid per meeting, but it has occurred to me from watching council now for 2 decades that there are some expenses tied to public service that maybe would be eligible for reimbursement, and we're looking into the legality of that. But it's a notion that I have. I would be happy to put it in front of you, let you vet it out. It will ultimately be your decision. But we see younger families, we see single parents or single persons struggling to serve because you really aren't paid much, and you know, if you only get $150 per meeting, how do you pay the babysitter, right? Things like that. So I just wanted to put that out there. This is totally me, maybe going out of my box. You don't have to adopt this, but certainly the hours that council members put in as elected officials is significant, and I think if we want to ensure that we continue to see diversity amongst our elected officials, this might be a way to help attain that, to make sure that you are being paid in a competitive way, and maybe there are some reimbursable expenses that we could consider to encourage folks in the future to run for office.
Yeah, Councilor Newman.
Since '08, has this ever been brought up? Like, obviously I don't know, I haven't been on council, but has council ever denied a raise?
Well, through you, Mayor, Councilor Newman, this is the first time ever that I have taken the liberty, like I said, to just look at council salaries as part of the overall budget of the city. I've never initiated this before. Whenever the city council has been looking at pay, it was always initiated by council. So that's why I say it might be out of my box. So to your question, when's the last time we looked at it? I think it has been a long time. I don't know if it goes back as far as '08. Maybe Nancy remembers, and we can certainly look it up because you have to adopt that by statute, or by ordinance, excuse me. But it has been a long time. Does anyone else on council remember?
I don't think it's come up. Let me turn on my, one thing that I think that we need to be aware of is that should we pass the ordinance, it doesn't take effect until the next election cycle.
Correct.
So we're not raising, we're not giving ourselves a raise. We're simply just saying that there would be more. I think we're limited to 150 a meeting, and we're at 120, correct?
That is correct.
And some councils have done things that I don't agree with, and that's saying being paid for committee meetings, which I don't agree with. I think we need to be paid for work sessions, council meetings, and special meetings.
Council, any other questions or comments here? Councilor Gabriel.
And Councilor Shumway, I think I can remember the time where city council members were paid $10 a year,
Well,
right? A year?
it was, I don't remember that. I remember $10 a meeting.
Oh, okay, maybe a
And when I
meeting.
was mayor, I made $240 that year.
Oh, all right. I thought it was a meeting. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, a year.
It was $10 per city council meeting.
There you go. Okay.
Thank you, Councilor Gabriel. City Manager, I appreciate you looking into this. I suspect when the council was paid $10 a meeting, the council was probably of a certain demographic. That is no longer the case. And I think as we look to a more reasonable, I think anything we can do, I think we will find that we have more candidates running for office, and that's better for everyone who lives in the city of Laramie. So it'll, everyone will work just that much harder. So I appreciate you, this is just my opinion, but I appreciate you looking into other reimbursable expenses that council members may incur in the course of doing our job, because we do spend a lot of time at these meetings, but we also spend far more time at committee meetings or just generally on our phones talking to, the numerous people that call you. So I think any place that we can find space for more competitive reimbursement would be helpful. And the council can obviously vote that up or down, but I sure appreciate you bringing it to us.
Council, what I will tell you about this, if you would like these funds to remain in the budget, do nothing. You'll still have to discuss them later on. You'll have to adopt any changes by ordinance. The city attorney will have to review them, particularly this notion I have for maybe reimbursable expenses, and to some degree, limited would be permissible. And Councilor Shumway is correct. Anything you would adopt would not affect you. It would go to the next year. Well, I mean, it would go to the next year. It won't affect you immediately. It won't change your paycheck next month. Yeah. So it's a long, ongoing conversation. Again, you just have to do nothing, and the money will be there for a future conversation. If you don't want to look at it that way, you can give us an amendment to remove those, and we can deal with it a different fashion at a later point. Okay. So that's sort of the highlights of. Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Richardson was raising.
City Clerk, you pointed that out, and I lost the thread as I was mumbling on. So Councilor Richardson, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to also point out that I believe the legislature just passed a law that said that folks who are serving at the city municipal level can also not accept a paycheck. So if you felt really passionately about not having that raised, you could certainly just donate it right back to the city. So.
Thank you, Councilor.
Very similar to Club's Hanson. I think you.
All right, City Manager, back to you.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on now to capital equipment and fleet, and that starts on page 77. Again, we're looking at general fund. Page 77 is a summary showing you the fleet schedule for, again, some historical data and then the recommended adjustment. There is a significant amount in that gray column, the first numerical column on the left, being a significant amount being rebudgeted. Again, carried over from current year, already approved monies that just haven't quite been spent yet. With fleet and equipment, as Jennifer noted, and I would reiterate, we've seen very slow delivery times on a lot of our pieces of equipment and our fleet vehicles, and so that accounts for really the majority of this nearly $4 million rebudget. Then there's a very small adjustment recommended for fleet and equipment and capital. And you'll see, actually, it's a downward adjustment, isn't it? I got to double check. There we go. Yeah, the supplemental is actually a decrease of $8,000. So these are minor items that I won't spend too much time with. If you'd like to see the detail of what vehicles are being replaced, that starts on the next page. We track our vehicles very carefully, tracking useful life, mileage, maintenance records, those sort of things to determine when, how, and where it's most cost-effective to replace them. And then at the bottom of page 78, we do the same for equipment. So you can see an inventory of the equipment items that are being replaced, as well as year, useful life, et cetera, mileage, hours of operation. That equipment schedule continues on to the next page. And the next page, and the next page. And I'm scrolling down then to go to capital, which is the largest of the adjustments, as you know, that we're recommending for fiscal '24. And that starts many pages forward on page 85. So again, the gray or the highlighted column, I guess it's showing up sort of pink highlight on the screens. That is what's being rebudgeted. So dollars already approved and projects already approved by council that are finishing out and we're just carrying funding forward to complete those in this next fiscal year. The supplemental adjustment being recommended is titled Fiscal 2024 SUPPL Supplemental. You'll see there's really very little being recommended for change there. There is a HVAC repair in City Hall. I was just talking to someone about this in my office. Aaron, maybe it was you when you came in a couple mornings ago. It was like 64 degrees in my office. Oh, it was Sharon. That's right. It was Sharon. Anyway, we've been struggling a little bit with the HVAC, so we're looking to make some repairs there. And then continuing on to the bottom, you'll see the total supplemental adjustment is 1 million, I think, in total. Am I in the right column? Yes, 1,074,000. Capital in the general fund, for all the reasons I've already said, is fairly light, simply because so much of it is in the capital construction fund. So we could go there and look at the big potatoes, not the small potatoes. And that is on page 122.
Councilor Doherty.
I want to point out to the many people following us at home that the document is in our agenda, and then there are these hyperlinks that are wonderful, right? So, thanks.
Thank you, Councilor.
Councilor Doherty. Okay, so Capital Construction Fund starts on page 122, accounting for multi-year capital projects. As Councilor O'Doherty said, you can click on the link if you want to read the project detail. The pink highlighted column on the screen are monies already approved, projects already approved and being rebudgeted from this current year to the one that starts July 1st. The next column to the right that says adopted shows the adopted budget for fiscal 24 starting July 1. And then the column that says fiscal 2024 supplemental is what changes I'm recommending to you. As we move down, you'll see there's a $485,000 adjustment to remove funding for Alta Vista Street rehabilitation, which fell down in the priority list once we completed our new pavement condition index ratings. And those funds have been now reapplied to a higher acuity or higher priority street, which means it's in worse condition, and that is Buford Street from 7th to 9th Street.
I lost my place.
Councilor Doherty.
Oh, that's okay.
122.
Yeah, we're on 122. I could use a change in the HVAC right now. If you go to page 123, there's some nice charts that the staff have prepared to show our major capital projects, so these multi-year capital projects by type. The pie chart at the bottom of the page, you'll see the lion's share of that pie chart in blue is where we are spending a huge amount of our capital project money, and that's in streets and storm drainage, 6.4 million or 69% of all of the adjustment. And then the next largest investment being in IT or technology improvements at 1.7. The bar chart next to it shows those adjustments. Oh, that's revenue, sorry. I think that is a typo, actually. And then beginning on the following page, page 124 is where the detailed information sheets for each of those projects is contained. Because they were already approved and there really is no new project other than the 7th to 9th at Buford, I won't go over those unless you would like me to discuss any of those projects. So that's a summary of everything being recommended for adjustment in general fund and major capital construction fund, whether adjusting up or adjusting down. And with that, I had hoped, if you have no questions, to switch tracks and kind of do a little deep dive into personnel, because personnel will be a very important change and adjustment in our budget in fiscal '24, if you're ready for that, Mayor. Okay.
City council members, any questions before we move on to personnel? Okay. Thank you, City Manager. We are ready.
Okay, very good. So I have a little PowerPoint that I prepared for this. I'll start off by saying we're going to start by looking at some highlights from the workforce report that we publish each year. HR is my partner in this. They crunch all the data, prepare the report. There's some give and take, some back and forth between them and myself. And we publish this on our website for the public, for ourselves, for staff, and of course for you as our elected officials. So here's some highlights from the workforce report. Right now, here's how our positions break out by service type, so the type of service that each position is providing. And you'll see that the orange column is our parks and recreation. The blue column is public works. Sorry, I gotta get my glasses. Thank you. Okay, that's better. Thank you. I apologize for the interruption. So 76.75, that's our police in orange, excuse me. Blue is public works, 47 positions in fire. We have 29 positions in our executive or administrative general government offices, and 26.5 in Parks and Rec, and 13 in administrative services. That's from fiscal 17. You can see when you look at fiscal 22, now 5 years ago, very little change in positions. We do have a couple more positions in public works. Those are in our enterprise-funded activities, if I remember correctly. Right now, 16% of our 261.8 city employees are eligible to retire, and in 5 years, we will have 11% more eligible to retire. So if you're looking for a great career, you know, if you're, yeah, would you click for me? I got one more. Thank you. If you're looking for a good career, the city has a lot of opportunity right now. We are struggling to fill positions like almost every other employer right now. I'm not sure where all of the workers have gone, but it is a struggle to hire here. And so we are a little bit low in staffing in many areas of the city right now. This new chart that popped up is just showing you that same data plotted over time from fiscal 12 to fiscal 22, which means the most recent data on this chart is about 1.5 years old. But you can see when you trend those areas of service out over time that we've seen really very little change in our staffing levels or numbers of FTEs over the last 10 years.
Councilor Pierce has a question.
Yeah, I might be a little early with this question. Have you had discussions, or are you looking at the potential for positions to be remote? Is that, are you kind of, is that part of what you're thinking about? Because we just recently hired a gal in my division who, you know, is just not coming to Laramie. She lives in Pocatello. So, right? And it works great.
Absolutely. Thank you. Through you, Mayor, Councilor Pierce, that's a great question. We have a lot of employees that have worked at least partially remote even before COVID. And since COVID, we have some employees who started working remote and have continued to. What I will tell you, though, I would love, I'll be honest, we have hired this consultant to conduct the analysis of our compensation, classification, and staffing. I just spoke with them about 3 weeks ago, and I said, any data you can bring me about how cities might engage remote workers, I'd love to hear. I'm all ears. But I think we have to remember the type of work we do, and that's a limitation, right? So there's the type of work. If you're a fireman, you can't really work remote, you know? If you're a policeman, you can't work remote. If you're a dispatcher, if you're in any of our more industrial functions in public works, street water, sewer, you can't work remote. But some of the jobs here at City Hall, IT jobs certainly could, and I think we'd be really open to that if that were the case. I will say, though, if you can do that work remotely, there's that issue. But there's another question in cities oftentimes, and that is many cities require their employees to live within the jurisdiction. So that's kind of more of a public policy question that would land in your realm. For my purposes, I'm pretty much open to it, especially given how difficult the hiring climate is right now. And we've been doing it without really, asking permission per se. But if it became a really significant trend where like everyone in City Hall worked in a different city, I'm not sure how the community or the city council would feel about that. So we would have to probably come and talk with you if it became a very significant part of our workforce that was remote.
Do we have any policy that states that now?
We do not. There are some policies in our public safety areas that say you have to be within a certain response if you're called in. So there's some area limitations there related to the type of work they do, but there's no requirement that I'm aware of that says you must reside within the jurisdictional boundaries of the city.
Okay, thanks.
So that's kind of how our workforce looks. Moving to the next slide, we know a lot of people are eligible to retire. Here's our turnover and retention numbers. Our turnover rate in fiscal 21 was 9%, and then it went up to 17.2% in fiscal 22. The national average for all jobs was 47.2%, but local government being a lot more stable than the national average at 18%. So although we went up remarkably from fiscal 21 to 22, it was kind of reflective of an overall trend in the labor market nationally and regionally and in the state. When we look at the past 10 years, our turnover rate's been really consistent, 10 to 12% each year. And turnover can mean people retired, people were asked to leave, or they chose to leave on their own but did not retire. I included this nice statistic that at the bottom of the page that Patty provided for us because I think it highlights the cost of turnover and why we need to work hard to keep the people that we have that are performing well for us. The National Association says it's about 6 to 9 months of an employee's salary is the cost it takes to replace them. And I would say in our public safety areas, police, fire, EMS, it's probably even higher as a percent of annual salary. But the statistic here is an employee making $60,000 per year, for example, it would take $30,000 to $45,000 to recruit and train a replacement for that person. So it's a good statistic to remind us that we should invest in the people we have, right? And then 16% of our current employees I guess I had this on the previous slide, are eligible to retire, and then we'll have 11% more in 5 years. So that's a concern, planning for that change, making sure we're mentoring and training new people. And again, if people are interested in a really great career, city has a lot of options.
Councilor O'Doherty.
Does the city have any, is there a required retirement age? There isn't, is there? Or?
There is in certain positions, public safety positions. I believe fire and possibly police executive positions have a maximum age, but there is no required age elsewhere. Typically, it seems people tend to retire around when they can maximize their benefit, right? So here's a look at our workforce plotted against the community and how our workforce has changed over time and how the number of residents in Laramie have changed over time. I talked to our staff about this as our customer service ratio. It's not exactly that, but coming out of private sector, that's sort of how I view it. What we see here is in fiscal 12, we had, for every one city position, that position served 115 residents. That dipped down a little bit in fiscal 16, and then it's crept up since fiscal 16 to where in 22, every city position serves 120.2 humans or residents. I shouldn't say residents because that service is provided to residents, but also to tourists and visitors who come into the jurisdiction. We track this in the workforce report as a really rough data point to try to ascertain when it maybe is time to take a broad look at the organization, make sure our staffing levels are reflecting the growth in population in Laramie, meaning more people to serve, and making sure that we have the right level of staff to serve the community. Here's a different way of looking at that same data. This is employees plotted against residents over the last 5 years. Our population, as you can see in the green trend line, continues to just increase pretty steadily. Over the last 20 years, it's been about 1% per year. I think in the last couple of years, I saw some data, I haven't had time to drill down on it, but it looked like it may have actually been 2% per year over the last couple. So I need to go out and confirm that. Next slide. So here's where we're at with our classification and compensation program review. City Council authorized this when you adopted the budget last year. Our intention was to begin this work in the fall of 2022. We put out a request for proposal, but maybe because every other employer in the world potentially is also commissioning work of this type, we were unable to get an applicant or any applications. So we had to re-advertise in the winter, and we were able to secure and go into contract with Bolton Consulting and Matrix Consulting as their sub-consultant. They've started this study just in the last few weeks. They will review our classification and pay system, and they will make recommendations to us to revise that, and then we will focus on moving forward to make those revisions as needed and as we can support them. They're going to look at our full-time benefited positions, but also looking at part-time wages to make sure we're kind of in the ballpark there, and we're not missing any opportunities to maybe pay differently or be more competitive in kind of a novel approach to some of those positions. This work is expected to be complete in September of 23. Did I get that right, Patty? September? Okay. I keep going back and forth in my head between September and October. September of 23, we expect we'll implement the outcomes of the study this fall. There is a reserve in the budget, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Well, we did talk about that, a reserve in the budget to fund this study since we weren't able to get it done and come forward with those changes now. Once the compensation and classification study is done, these same consultants will then start a staffing study, and that staffing study we expect to have done before we bring the next biennium budget to you. We'll use that data to inform changes to staffing that we might recommend. Do y'all have questions about the program at all, or the study, the analysis?
Council members, any questions? Okay. Councilor Pierce.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I just want to say thanks for doing this. I think it's really important, so I appreciate this.
Yeah, you know, and it's time. It would be time for us to do this as an organization, even if COVID didn't happen, inflation didn't happen, and wage inflation didn't happen. Last time we did this was in 2015. By the time we implemented it, it was early 2016, I think. I like to tell our staff, for me, I think this is something that an organization of our size, an employer of our size, should do probably every 7 to 10 years at least. And so it's sort of time for us to do that. But then with the inflation we've seen, and then that inflating wages, it's really needed. I suspect that it will come back and tell us our wages are a little bit lagging in the market. I think everybody believes that to be the case. I don't know. I guess we'll see what they tell us, but I'll be surprised if it doesn't say that. And I suspect that may be in part why we're having trouble recruiting, right? There is a shortage of applications and workers, but if our salaries were a little more competitive, it would likely be more likely to entice people to take a risk on joining our team. Okay, so if no questions there, I'm going to switch gears. We're going to go talk about fire EMS. Oh,
Councilor Shumway.
I'm going to make an assumption, and I could be wrong. I'm assuming that we don't have a problem with provisional workers, part-time.
Mayor, through you, Councilor Shumway, that's a great question. And you know what? We have a terrible difficulty recruiting provisional workers. In fact, it may be more difficult to recruit provisional part-time or temporary folks since COVID than it is to recruit permanent benefited positions. We have just struggled. We can't get lifeguards. We can't get summer help in mosquito, parks, cemetery. It's very, very challenging. And the wages have gone up dramatically in that arena. Todd and I, we were just talking a couple days ago that while our consultant is going to give us sort of a second opinion on wages for part-time employees, we can kind of do our own informal wage study just driving down Grand Avenue. And when you see that one of the local fast food restaurants has a banner outside says their starting wage is $15 an hour, you know, there's kind of your market analysis. So we've been struggling to keep up with pay and to even get applicants. So if you know good people who want to work part-time in the summer or work part-time all year for us, we could really use them. A lot of opportunity. And that is maybe new for Laramie, right? As a college town, I think we've enjoyed a strong labor pool in those kinds of positions, and I don't know why it is not strong anymore.
Wow.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Before I move on, Patty, do you want to add anything? Did I miss anything?
I think you got all the selling points. I think the...
Hey, Patty, could you use a microphone? You can stay there, just use the
She's
microphone.
injured.
The consultants has actually started the staffing study for the majority of the city this week. They have started putting out the questions to all the other cities and counties in the area to find out where they stand so that they can get some numbers together. Meanwhile, they have all of our staff doing position analysis of their own positions so we can actually compare apples to apples and make sure that all of our employees are recognized for what they actually do on the job.
Great, thank you.
I'll have Dan come up here. So I wanted to shift gears to fire EMS as promised. The largest single recommended change in the personnel budget coming to you is coming out of Dan's section. I think, Council, you know we've struggled for a number of years to address staffing in the fire department, and please remember it's fire EMS. In fact, the majority of the calls are EMS calls. The capacity to meet the call load is really stretched on the EMS side. You'll remember probably, is it 4 years ago now, Dan? 4 or 5 years ago, we came to you with an idea for a provisional driver program. You approved that, we implemented that, that's been in place since. Those are part-time folks who will drive the ambulance on transfers when we transfer patients between one hospital to another. That's been successful. It took a little bit of load off, but it wasn't the magic bullet. A few years ago, now a year and a half ago, I think, we executed an agreement with Albany County. They agreed to contribute to the EMS services that we provide extraterritorially, meaning outside of the city of Laramie and throughout Albany County. And not a lot of folks know that, but this city has provided EMS to all of Albany County for decades now. So it was really exciting to see the county come to the table and be through contract supporting those services continuing. Dan's going to talk to you about the items in orange. I am recommending that we make the paramedic pilot program that you approved for this current year as a one-year pilot permanent, at least for another 4 years, due to the good work of the fire department to secure a grant. Dan will give you the detail. We also are conducting an operational analysis of EMS in partnership with our hospital partner. Dan will give you more detail. And then last year, we told you we were going to conduct some overhiring in the fire department for fire personnel. And for the new folks here, the staffing levels of the city, 43, for instance, in the fire department, they are set by you. We, as a management tool, will overhire, knowing maybe that we have an employee who's going to retire in 6 months. We may hire for that position ahead of time, and for a temporary period of time, have 44 employees and exceed the hiring authority. But we know that that will come back within your approval before too long. So the fire department last year, we let you know we were going to start experimenting with overhiring to build more depth on the fire line. We did do that, and we do expect to continue that this year. There's some extraneous circumstances that I think we're going to be very aggressive with overhiring, and again, I'll let Dan give you all the detail. I am supportive of everything Dan's going to speak to you about, and I think it will go a long way to assuage some of the issues, that we heard about last night. We know that staffing is an issue in this department.
Thank you, City Manager, and welcome, Chief.
Honorable Mayor, members of council, I'm back again. So. I'll just kind of go through, you and me just hit the orange spots?
Yeah.
Let me go through this paper.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's great. Yeah.
Okay, so Janine talked about the paramedic pilot program. We were approved for a block, and we didn't tie it to FTEs. We just did the best we could with a block of money. And we had enough to hire 3.5 is what we were, what that budget would support. We began recruiting. We were approved. We didn't get our first hires done until August. We filled out our last hire in February of this year. It was hard recruiting because it was advertised as a pilot program. People are generally not wanting to be experimented with. They want, if they're doing full-time work. We have some real good paramedics working with us right now, and it has taken some edge off of the call load. Right now we have 3 full-time, and since we got started late, we had some money, so we have 2 part-time working in that. So I put in a budget request to go from 200 to 350,000 on that program. Was the request. What we achieved, we wrote a grant about 2-3 months ago. You approved us submitting a grant. We asked for $630,000. There's $630,000 would have required a $630,000 match. I was notified we were going to be awarded $600,000. So since then, I've had 2 correspondence with the Hospital Association and Department of Health, and I think I've got everything submitted. They wanted budgets. So you should see a grant award coming before you, hopefully within the next month. Of that $600,000 is divided up over 4 years. $430,000 of that would be for wages into the paramedic program. $170,000 of that's for ambulance refurbishes. So it's equipment and personnel. Is there any questions on the pilot paramedic program?
Councilors, any questions? Councilor Doherty, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess. Is that transferring to other hospitals, would that be included in those? Were they doing that job too in that time?
They're included in all of our emergency response and interfacility transfers, and they can work events if they would, like to sign up for events. We have, for the health of a workload, so we did 550, I can't remember, it's getting toward the upper 500s we're on a pace for, of interfacility transfers. They're long in nature, so it's difficult to get them all done, so we're not just loading all those onto 3 people, so they rotate in, they do take several transfers. They take more than the firefighters now, because when they ask for paramedics, that's the paramedics we have, so they're taking quite a few transfers. So.
Councilor Doherty and then Councilor Sherman.
The reason I ask is I understand a lot of people had to be transferred from Ivinson to other hospitals, and not because of lack of beds, but lack of nursing staff. So has it gone up in the last 6 months to a year?
Honorable Mayor, Councilor Doherty, I'll read some numbers for you. 2017, we did 358 IFTs. 2018, we did 323. 2019, we did 376. In 2020, we did 443. In 2021, we did 518. In 2022, we did 573. At the pace we're going, we started trying to negotiate a new agreement with IMH a year ago, last October, and at the rate of the growth of that part of the business alone, we realized we just do not have the capacity to keep that pace up. if you project those numbers out in 5 years from now, we're going to be looking at 1,050. So that's one of the reasons we're kind of hung up in negotiating and hired a consultant to look at the whole business model and how we're getting this accomplished. The issue we face as a department is totally a capacity issue, in my opinion. We have, so if we turn the clock back, 2010, we opened up Station 3. The department ran 3,188 calls, roughly 8.7, 8.9, something like that a day. We had got up to 15 FTEs per shift at a budget cut in 14 or 15, somewhere around there. We cut back $360,000. We cut back personnel to 14 FTEs per shift. That co-load's gone from 3188 up to last year was 4825. So we're running just shy of 15. Now, the thing that's tough about that is if you have a day where you have 3 calls and you're averaging 15, they get really, that capacity becomes an issue. We have to be ready to serve the public's needs. The transfer, when you have 2 on the road at the same time, and if you only have 11 firefighters on shift, that only leaves 7 people on duty. That's where the civilian paramedics have helped out, where the provisional drivers have helped out. So it's really, we're focusing on capacity and the ability to serve the community and IMH what they need. They need to get patients out, and if we're going to have that responsibility, we need to be able to step up and do it for them. Last year was the first year we've had many times where we had to delay and or call other organizations to try to help us out. We just did not have the people to put out on the road.
Mayor,
Thank
we're
you for that.
passing around the charts that Dan's referring to.
Thank you.
For the council, we made some quick copies for you.
Oh, the top 2?
Yeah.
City clerk's always making our lives just a little bit easier. Thank you. And thank you for that information, Chief. That is helpful context for this conversation. Councilor Shumway.
Chief, just some general questions. Let me give you 3 or 4 and you can answer them all at once. Do the paramedics stationed out of the hospital or out of this fire station, are all of the firefighters also, I know they're EMTs, but they're not paramedics in the sense it's a different classification, I think. And then I guess the last question I have is, since we only have like 3 and 2 provisional, is that something to where we're trying to take some of the load off the EMTs with paramedics? And anyway, I just want to know where they're stationed, how, and I'm sure that they would probably want to move into a firefighter EMT designation for a higher pay. That would be an assumption I'd make. So kind of address those things for us so we kind of get a feel of what kind of employees we're working with.
Honorable Mayor, Councilor Shumway, so they're they run out of the fire stations. Most of the time we manage them out of Station 1. There is a few times where we'll send, based on what's going on, we'll send one to an outlying station. They'll team up with that company to help run calls. But for the most part, they're running out of Station 1. The firefighters, so I have 42 online firefighters. They're required to maintain a EMT intermediate ACLS certification. So that's basically just below a paramedic. We have several firefighters that have gone through paramedic training, and when they become paramedics, one of the bad things is they become a lot more Front Range likes to hire them away when they achieve that, because there's a big demand for them through the Front Range, and they pay quite a bit. So the firefighters, even the company officers, equipment operators, firefighters, they're all required to be able to give that ALS level of care. So I have We require through our civil service now, when we hire, they're an EMT basic minimum, and then we'll get all the firefighters to the mandatorily to the EMT intermediate ALS, and then we will support firefighters the best we can to get to paramedics, those that choose to move farther in that. As far as really the purpose of the civilian paramedic blending that in is not to really take load off of firefighters as much as to help us handle the capacity of everything we're hitting. I think it works hand in hand. Some of the load is taken off, but firefighters are task oriented. You know, they go on a call, they're in a company, they're not like managing a whole system, or so they're running on a call and they're focused on that call, and then another one comes, and it's the shift commander that's really straining and struggling to try to figure out how to cover all this stuff with the IFT requests and, moving units around and stuff. So, it's been a real help. It's really helped. One of the good things about the paramedics is we don't train them to be paramedics, we hire them as paramedics. And then we train them into our system through an orientation. So it takes a lot of hours to get to an EMT intermediate level. Then it takes another 1,200 hours of training to get from that level to a paramedic certification. So that's been a benefit to us, hiring them with that certification and that education. There was one other question you asked, and I can't remember what it was. I was trying to write them down.
Well, I think my question is probably wrong. I was thinking that a paramedic would be a lower pay than a firefighter EMT.
Yes.
So I'm guessing that they probably are equivalent or higher.
We have, the paramedic program is pretty new. I expect in the future that we'll have some that want to test and go through the civil service procedure to try to get hired on as the firefighter also. We've had several of our provisional drivers that are very interested in wanting to work as a firefighter, and they sign up for the provisional driver program and assist, and they learn a lot more about us, and they get their EMTs certifications, and then they'll take the test. We've hired probably 3 or 4 of our provisional drivers that have taken our test and done well. It's kind of a good deal because we're already interviewing them when they're working for us. We really know what their character is, and we've got some real good provisional drivers. So,
Mayor, through you, Councilor Shumway, the compensation rate for paramedic is lower than for full-time benefited firefighter EMT.
I'll throw some other data. Since I was throwing out some data points, I'll go ahead and throw some other data points out for you. When I talk about capacity, one of the things that catches my attention is the overlap of call. I call it overlap of calls. And so I ran an analysis. Well, I had someone that knows how to pull this data for me to run the analysis, and they handed it to me, so I'll read it to you. We had, I asked them to run, when we have a call going, how often, what % of the time do we have another call going? Because that's that capacity issue I'm talking about. I couldn't flesh it out where, like, I can do it when there's more than one, but I couldn't tell you if there's like 3, 4, or 5 going at the same time. But year to date of this year, we're at 48.45% of the time we're running mobile calls. Last year was 48.18. In 21, it was 47.67. In 2020, it was 70.24. Now, that was an outlier because we spent so much time. That was the COVID year. I mean, we had to decon ambulances after, so a call was really drawn out. Every call was really drawn out. It was quite an effort to follow the guidelines and the recommendations and all the decontamination. So that's kind of, I bring it up. I should just throw that stat out because we're back to the 48. So half the time we've got mobile calls going. Another data point I'd like to bring out in 2021, our holdover, I call it our staffing holdovers. We spent $66,000. Last year we spent $333 just trying to achieve minimum staffing levels. So that's why we talked quite a bit about it and looking at, we're wearing our people out. We need to get some overhires in here to help us The training program to get a firefighter through and online is typically about 10 to 12 weeks, depending on the curriculum we adopt. We pulled out of the Front Range Fire Consortium. We were getting priced out of that market. We started a partnership with Cheyenne. That's grown into what they call the Wyoming State Academy now. We just put a person online this week, just graduated this last week, and there was 5 departments, the 5 civil service departments all participated in that academy. We will, that's a lot more cost effective for us. One of the problems we run into is we run a joint academy twice a year. Typically, we kick off in January and then August, September. So when you have a person leave in February and you hire and they can't go to the academy until September, then it's a whole year you're running short. With the overhires, we want to run our own academy this summer. We have the facility to do it now, and we'll run an academy for some recruits this summer and invite a few people from other departments. And then the fall one we'll participate with supporting that.
And Chief, I have a couple questions if we can throw them at you. Councilor Gabriel?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Chief, you're getting to it, but maybe I missed it, and I apologize, but this list that was sent around about total calls by volume, year by year, looks steady from 14 to 18, and then, and I think you're getting to this, but a significant rise from 18 to 22, and then, of course, the inter-facility transfers the same way. But I think you're eventually getting there, but why more responsibility in your department, but a significant increase from 18 to 22?
The Honorable Mayor, Councilor Gabriel, I don't have a real good answer for that other than the call load has just gone up, and it's pretty much 80% EMS. Pretty much 21% of that is outside of the city limits within the county. The county really did step up in our partnership and has assisted. We signed the first one for 200. The second agreement was 225, and I believe verbally we'll be bringing one before you, but verbally this next year is supposed to be 275. And then we're going to be going into hopefully a pro forma we can negotiate out, so it's a percentage, so we're not negotiating out a fixed cost every year. I'm real happy that we're getting this study done. We are going to look at that study through the district legislation that passed and see what that means. When I read through it, I'm not quite sure what that means for this community. I can see how it's going to be real advantageous in other spaces, but we have to really look at it and see what direction we want to go here. So.
And it was just remembering what the city manager had said about population. It's been, fairly steady, a couple of thousand here over the past few years. And so, that certainly would have a significant impact, but population-wise, we haven't increased that much as compared to what we were seeing here. It doesn't seem like to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor and then Councilor Pierce.
Thank you very much, Chief, for walking us through this. I have a couple of questions, and I'm just curious, this model of the municipality providing transfer service to the local hospital, is that a common model that people use?
Honorable Mayor, Councilor Cumby, it's if you're running an ambulance service, it's common to do interfacility transfers, and it's common for those organizations to struggle with how they're getting them done now. I spoke with a manager at a pretty big facility in the Front Range, probably can't remember, about 3 weeks ago, and I didn't even bring up the topic. He's the one who's like, we're struggling trying to get this staffed, the IFTs staffed. So it's not unique here.
And with, you're compensating for this really significant increase over the past few years. To me, it's kind of staggering. And it seems like there's not a lot of incentive for the hospital or other agencies to explore the provision of different types of services that are not drawing upon highly trained, skilled individuals. And it seems to me that it puts the community at risk when that happens, especially if there were a mass casualty event. And to me, it would seem to really lower morale over time that you have an individual who puts all of that work and effort into training, and then they wind up driving for hours all over the place, and that's really kind of, I just find it untenable.
You know, when you read exit interviews, those are issues, those are topics. You hit on some of the issues we deal with. One thing I will say is moving forward to try to get this agreement right for the conditions we face, and city manager was wise enough to say, I want a 10-year projection out on costs and revenues, and they're going to do that. When we got into the 5-year agreement in 2017, that agreement, in my opinion, was probably pretty sustainable under that call load and under those conditions, and if things would have remained the same, that probably could just carry forward and sign it again and we'd be fine. We're not under those conditions anymore, and we can't catch, I always call it the tail of the dog capacity-wise. We're so far behind with it's growing too fast, and our revenues do increase. We went from 1.36 to 1.45 in revenue, but we're running the wheels off of an ambulance, every year. We're having to replace more than one ambulance a year now, or refurb more than one ambulance a year. So we've expanded to 6 ambulances that try to handle the call load. When you have an ambulance that's getting refurbed, and then you might have one in the shop, and you have 2 out on transfers, it doesn't leave much in town left to run calls. So we have to really watch that. So.
Counselor.
We're trying to be aggressive on overhires, in my opinion. It's based off of the last year's experience. I've never seen a year like last year with running the shortages we did. We were just to make minimum staffing levels, and as Commander Lamb said last night, that's even at minimum staffing level. They struggle to get everything done with 11 people. We were having some days where we had 3 holdovers just to make the 11. Of the 14 sign-on shift, we've still got 2 out on long-term injury that just haven't recovered. We had another 4, I believe it was 4 people injured. We had 2 long-term absences due to, there were some complications with some childbirth, so there were some long-term absences there. COVID has run through our department. We go to those calls. Our guys, no matter how hard they try, they get it. And we've had several bouts of runs of COVID and long absences with that. Retirements, we had 2 what I consider retirements, and then we had another couple of guys that took other jobs in other jurisdictions. I've ran data back to 2010, and we average 4.9. So we're right at that 10, 11%. We just can't take a person and in 2 weeks have them up and ready and running. It just takes us so long to get them going. So we're running just below our average is a 5. So we thought an aggressive, we exercised, we did overhire we tried 3 times, but we exercised it twice, and each time we exercised it within a month, someone else is gone. So I had retired or whatnot, so I had complained earlier that this isn't working too good for us, but then I realized, well, it's actually working pretty good because we'd even be one other guy down, so it was just trying to get out ahead of it. We just haven't got out ahead of it yet. And if we can get through this summer, then I think this fall, with some over-hire situations, we'll be healthy going into the fall season, so without other things that I can't predict happening. So.
Sure. Yeah, Chief, you're sure making the case for the overhire. Councilor Pierce.
Yeah, thanks. Not to derail the conversation too much, but, recently we had the agreement with the county, which is a public entity, right? And we happen to have a really big public entity within the center of our community, UW. And have we looked at the numbers, in terms of what percentages of those calls are going to the university? And just to add a little fire to that, it wasn't too many years ago that we wanted to go into partnership and purchase some equipment. I think it was a fire truck. I can't remember exactly what kind of fire truck. And we were told, too bad, right? So I'm just kind of curious if we've looked at the expense of UW.
Honorable Mayor, Councilor Pierce, a little history back in 2003. Up till 2003, there was an operational agreement with the university that paid 1% of our operating costs. In 2003, there was a negotiation that they paid half. State Land Investment Board paid half of a ladder truck, and then the university and city split the match. So it was basically $200,000 from the university, $200,000 from the city, and then $400,000 from State Land Investment Board. That was in 2003, and that was the last time they participated in any kind of funding to the city. In 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, I can't remember the years going by. Janine and I went over to the State Land Investment Board trying to secure some funding for the Clint, for the ladder. And we were directed by the governor to try to get money from the university, which we did, and I still have the letter that they would not, they support the project, but they would not participate in that. So that's really, they just have taken a line that they don't participate in funding of anything on that. So
In terms of the percentage of the calls, because you said earlier that roughly 20% is in the county, and they're, in partnership and reimbursing for that 20%. I'm just curious, of the remaining 80%, is it 10% to UW? Is it?
I would have to do some data analysis on that. I've done that before and looked at it for talking points, but I can't remember those numbers off. I haven't reviewed them in a long time, so.
Thank you. It might be, it's not like you've got a lot of free time, but it might be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Councilor Pierce. Councilor Shumway.
We had a conversation with the county about providing their own ambulance service, and they looked into it and found out it was well over $1 million, between $1 million and $2 million a year. So they were very agreeable to have some kind of an agreement with us, which is working. We had the option of saying we're not going to give service outside the city limits, which of course we wouldn't have done. We would continue to provide that service. We probably also have that option with the university, and I don't think that we'll exercise that, but it could be a part of the discussion. One thing we do know is about half of the ambulance events are not paid. The hospital gets paid for maybe half, and so our portion comes out of that through the collections that the hospital does. So maybe we could look into how many students pay for ambulance calls, and then take that data to the university and say, we'll provide this if you support our ambulance service. Otherwise, get your own ambulance service.
Honorable Mayor, Councilor Shumway, I do know some data, our collection rate, which is real norm for the industry, is 47% of what's billed out. So any call that goes in that area, that's what I would expect would be average. Any special event we worked is 100% reimbursable. That's on a different contract you see every August come before you, and that's on a per hour. So we bill them out on an annual basis. So we do get reimbursed for all the time we're at the university working events. The ambulance revenue is just through our normal billing with IMH that would come from any call on anywhere in town, so.
Thank you, Counselor. Any other questions? Okay, back to you, Chief. Anything else you'd like to add to this?
Well, I could talk all night, but I heard there was a time where you guys only made $10 in a meeting, so I better cut this short. I'm just kidding.
Chief, we're living large these days.
Let's see. I do appreciate the opportunity to stand. It's been 2 nights in a row you've had to listen to me talk about these issues, but I do appreciate the opportunity to stand before you and try to go over some of the issues we're facing, and appreciate the support we've had. We've always had good support from council, and we really appreciate that. Guys all know that. So.
Thank you, Chief. Council, any other questions or comments? Vice Mayor?
I just want to thank you for the presentation and for laying out kind of the scope of things. It's really serious food for thought.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Councilor O'Doherty.
I'm really hung up on these inter-facility transfers, and I was wondering, is it a driver and an EMT, so in any case, we have to take somebody away? Like if you have a driver that's not, the provisional drivers, could that be Joe Citizen, who's a good driver, or Jill Citizen? I'm a good driver, but I would be terrified to do that. So then somebody else is in the ambulance with the patient?
Honorable Mayor, Councilor O'Doherty, it could be a combination of 2 firefighters. It could be a provisional with one of our paramedics. It could be a provisional with one of our drivers. It could be, it just depends on our shift commanders have to manage the staffing and the workload they have and what they have planned for the day.
So just
Vice Mayor, go
to
ahead.
clarify, each transfer requires 2 people to accompany that one patient?
Councilor Cumby, yes, it requires a driver, and then we have to have an attendant in the back. And if we need extra help, we try to get a nurse or an RT or try to get assistance from the hospital. They provide it when they can. If not, there's times where we have to send 2 in the back. We try to keep that to a minimum because that just really cuts into our staffing.
Thank you.
Councilor Newman?
He just answered my question. I wanted to know
Excellent.
if we could use some sort of nursing staff to kind of help with that. But
I think when we, Councilor Newman, I think when we get through this study, there's going to be some real creative things we'll be talking about. I think, just so you're aware, we, in our negotiations, the IMH did check on the cost of having like this done from someone other than us, and they come back and talk to us. So they're motivated. We're motivated. We want to serve our community. We want to do a good job. They want us to continue to work with them, and we just need to get a system that works for both sides. It's not working well for the city right now. I'm confident that we'll either have an agreement that works well for both sides, or we won't. We'll do something different. So that's kind of where we're at. So,
Thank you for that. Council, any other questions? Okay, thank you, Chief. Really appreciate it. City Manager.
So Council, wrapping up this slide, the paramedic pilot program being continued for another 4 years and accepting the grant to pay for half of that is a recommendation for you in the budget. If you do nothing, we will accept the grant, and we will be committed to that program for 4 more years. The expense is significant. It's more than $600,000 of city money, matching that much money in grant revenue, but we'll provide for staff in the ambulance, replace an ambulance, excuse me. The operational analysis is already underway, and the hospital has committed to pay 2/3 for that, and the city pay 1/3. As Dan said, that'll be very informative for us. And then the overhiring of 4 individuals, we estimate the cost of that at about $348,000. We expect that this year we will see 4 positions become vacant, slotting those overhires into back fully authorized positions. There is some risk to doing that, though, and that's why I like to bring this to your attention. As I said before, we use overhiring as a management tool to keep ourselves able to provide services, but there is some risk, right? If only 3 people leave the department this year, then I could be back here this time next year saying we're overstaffed by a position and we need a budget amendment. So I want to be transparent about that we're using this as a tool. We expect it to be a short-term fix, and we expect that we'll manage within the budget and the FTE allocation you've given us, but there's a risk that it may not pan out the way our crystal ball thinks it will, so.
Thanks, City Manager. Councilor Newman? Okay. Just keeps happening to you.
Sending it out. Right.
I just wanted to make sure it was something short-term.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I've used overhiring too, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
Sometimes, even after you do it, you have to do it again. Is that something that we might have to look at going forward as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And as the chief said, he did try to overhire already a few times in the current fiscal year. You're trying to get ahead of the turnover rate, right? And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Right now, there are a number of departments in the community hiring, and so the department just went through a hiring exercise. And recognizing there are other competing nearby departments that are trying to hire a bunch of people, and folks will compete, between departments. That was part of the reason that Dan made the decision to overhire by 4, to try to get those best and brightest in our organization, and not in other ones that we won't name, so, yeah. The other thing I would say is when we overhire, there's that outlay of cash, but also the hope is, as Dan said, that we're reducing holdover, and that means overtime. So from a budgetary outlook or perspective, you're paying people to train and hopefully make them permanent employees and not, continuing to pay overtime.
Thanks, City Manager. Councilor Richardson?
Do you stagger that overhiring, or is it basically, as you're speaking right now, it sounds like it's pretty tough to get folks anyway. I'm just curious about that, or if it's a bulk kind of all 4 at once.
That's a great question, and Chief, you can back me up if you'd like, but typically in police and fire, because they're civil service, we will go through hiring exercises under those rules, and there's sort of a class of applicants that are vetted, and then they're ranked, and they're put on an eligibility list, and so this department, like with the 4 hires, they've just 5 actually, because there is one vacant position, there's sort of a cohort of groups that are hired. I think there's some efficiencies in that, Councilor Richardson, to some degree, because you can train them as that cohort and, maybe just train half the year, not train one person all year long, every year, rotating for eternity. Yeah. Okay.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. City Manager, any other questions while we're, okay.
Okay, so I'm moving off fire. For those pieces in orange, if you do nothing, they'll move forward. If you would like to do something different, you'll be counseled on how to fill out an amendment form to the budget at the end of this evening. This is wrapping up the general fund. I just want to point this out for you, and we do have Chief Brown with us here. You do not have this recommendation in your budget document, and that is because the chief and I were not sure if we wanted to proceed with this when the budget was put together back in March. We've subsequently had some conversation, and as you know, it's been a discussion, but also there is standing direction via a resolution adopted by council for staff to look at some ways to augment or even maybe differently approach our responses when we get calls for service related to mental health crises. We have been working with the Albany County Mental Health Board, as you all well know, and the reason that we didn't have this in the budget was because we're trying to work with those partners. The city doesn't have a division of mental health and wellness services for the community, and so we've been working with partners who really have that skill set. We developed this, I call it a pocket proposal, because we recognize that the council may wish to forge forward before the Mental Health Board comes forward with a fully fleshed out community-wide approach and change or option for responding to these calls. And so in talking with the chief, we looked at what we as a municipality could bring to the table without waiting for that bigger vision from our partners. We yesterday discussed this pocket proposal with Councillor Cumby and Councillor Somerville. Councillor Cumby being our representative on the Mental Health Board, and she and Andy have both been really active with that group, and let them know that this pocket proposal is there if it's something council would want to pursue. And here's the kind of short and sweet. This would be a pilot program for implementation of behavioral mental health field options. E911 can use it as well as our officers. Chief Brown is here. He can answer any detailed questions that you have, but what you need to know about this is it's not in the budget. And if it's something that you would like us to pursue, the estimated cost about $40,000 to pilot this. It would need to be added proactively, and thus the reason we did discuss this with the two counselors working with the Mental Health Board, thinking, first, they would want to know about it since it's in a sphere that they're already supporting. Anyway, I'll stop there, and if you have questions, Chief Brown is welcome to come up, and you can grill him.
Thank you, City Manager. Council members, any questions on this? Councilor Pierce. Also welcome, Chief Brown.
Thank you.
So when you say, and this is probably a very basic question, when you say telebehavior, you mean on the phone?
Through you, Mr. Mayor? Not necessarily. So what we're looking at, I came across an industry professional who works in Norman, Oklahoma, and they have approximately 172 officers, a population of 117,000, and a large college, I believe, the University of Oklahoma is also there. So I started talking about some of the stuff that they were doing, and they just implemented a program where they're contracting with a counseling firm, led by a psychologist, and they have several clinicians on staff, and they're providing 24/7 operational coverage to have a tele-behavioral health program that's done through an app. So it's iPhones, iPads, whatever their officers have access to. So the way that I envision this potentially working for our area, one, we haven't received the data yet from Dr. Claire White that we provided to her as part of the Mental Health Board. So we're waiting to get an in-depth analysis of exactly what our call for service or welfare checks show us. But taking a straw poll from our dispatchers or emergency 911 operators, they estimate that approximately 90% of our mental health related calls are nonviolent calls. So that's potentially 90% that could be handled through this app. I think there's a couple different ways that we could approach it. One way would be to issue our officers and potentially long-term our EMS professionals iPads that have the ability to connect with a mental health professional within 5 to 10 minutes, a clinician or a psychologist. And the second way that I would like to approach it is to train our dispatchers to evaluate the call when it comes in to determine if it's a violent or nonviolent situation, and at that point direct them specifically or uniquely to the app, the tele app, if they have the resources to do it.
Go ahead. Sure.
So I believe in this last session, did the God, I can't even talk. Didn't they pass that you don't have to have a Wyoming license to practice mental health in the state of Wyoming?
As of January 1st, 2024, you're correct. They're going to be part of the, I think it's the Interstate Counseling Cooperative. It's something along those lines. What it's.
Is it compact?
Compact, correct. So there's 18 states that participate. So potentially with this program, and I've already spoken with a vendor out of Colorado. It's the only one that I could find that's local. And they are providing services to 2 areas in Colorado. One's Rio Blanco County. It's in the southern portion of Colorado, and it's a rural community also. And the second one, I don't recall the name, but they've been used 7 times through this process. So basically, I believe the fee was $1,000 a month buy-in, and then $300 to $350 per call.
Because that could actually help us in this arena, perhaps, and that's starting 2024, did you say? January?
January 1st of 2024, the licenses from Colorado and 17 other states will transition into Wyoming, and Wyoming licenses for counseling also
Great.
will work in 17 other states, or 18 other states.
That's amazing. I'm surprised that was really good thinking.
I'm going to head on to Zoom for Councilor Somerville, back to Councilor Newman, and then to the Vice Mayor.
Okay.
Thanks, Mayor. I guess just to chime in a little bit on this and give the council a heads up, I do plan to bring this amendment, hopefully with Vice Mayor Cumby, if she will sign on with me to go ahead and put this as a placeholder in the budget. But it is my hope to hopefully bring some additional funding to this pilot program. And kind of along the veins of what the chief was talking about, also look at how we connect that into our local services and our local continuum of care so that we're maximizing that as much as we can. We would be, one of the first places in Wyoming to pursue this. And I think it's a good opportunity. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilor Somerville. Councilor Newman?
So, 2 things, if I may. Chief, I had to step out, so maybe I missed this part. Is this something that we can just give the patient the iPad and they talk directly to the counselor, or are they going to talk through the officer to the counselor?
So, through you, Mr. Mayor, Councilman Newman, my preference would be that an officer doesn't respond to the location. So that's going to take some additional training, but that's working in Norman, Oklahoma. And what they're seeing there is that as soon as a call from someone who's experiencing these types of symptoms is made, oftentimes it's a cry for help. And if we have the ability through dispatch to connect them directly to a mental health professional, potentially our officers won't need to respond, or in some situations not respond. In the situations where they would respond, the goal would be to hand that situation over to a mental health professional. So instead of talking through an officer, it would be handing them the iPad, handing them the cell phone, the resource with the app that gives them direct access to that individual.
Second follow-up, I just wanted to say thank you. Thinking outside the box when it comes to mental health and something like that, using apps or however to where we can get response faster, that means a lot. I've had family die from this, so it does mean a lot.
Thank you, and I can't take all the credit for this. This is something that the city manager and I have been working on, and unbeknownst to us, Councilmember Somerville had also been working on it in her private job. So I will also say this, I have a meeting set up, I believe in 2 weeks with, I believe his title is the Vice President of the VOA for the state of Wyoming, and he's also interested in participating in a pilot program. There may be some additional funding behind that. I'm not comfortable speaking to yet because I haven't had a chance to meet with him, but I am confident that they do also have a desire to participate in this type of program and hopefully provide appropriate wraparound services so that it's not just simply us responding to a call, providing them that initial contact, but also VOA being able to provide appropriate wraparound services to ensure that person gets the long-term treatment that's needed.
Thank you, Chief. Thanks for your patience, Vice Mayor, to you, and then to Councilor O'Doherty.
And I have a couple of comments, and I think been important to all of us that we work, and as we crafted our ordinance and our resolutions, et cetera, that we would work with the Albany County Mental Health Advisory Board and, work congruently as a community and not kind of go off on our own. And I'd like to say that this is very congruent with the progress and the conversations that are going on within that board. And the board has split into some working subcommittees, and one subgroup is crisis response. And as we've been working separately and have come back, it's interesting to me, remarkable, how the ideas are starting to mirror each other. And so there's a lot of compatibility, and I believe there's potential for this to be a cohesive, maybe wraparound type of endeavor.
And Mr. Mayor, if I can add one more thing, I did speak with Sheriff Applehans today at length regarding this program. He's very interested in participating also. And then Assistant Chief Terry presented it to Chief Sam at the university today when they were at a meeting, and he's also interested in participating. So there is some community buy-in.
That's great. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Vice Mayor. Councilor Doherty.
Of the people that I know with mental health problems, the ones that I'm not directly subsidizing, they're going to have trouble with internet access. So I think that's another good reason for us to maybe have some towers around, or I don't know if towers is the right word, but ways for city internet to be available to the public that doesn't have internet, because the folks I know, their phones change every month or something because they couldn't pay the bill, so it's something that we're going to have to really try to find a way for those, if we're lending an iPad, for those to have connections or for people to have apps. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilor.
Good point.
Vice Mayor, go ahead. Oh, sorry, Councilor Shumway, and then I'll come back to you. Go ahead.
I don't believe that there's a clinical psychologist in the state of Wyoming. I think that's probably one of the reasons why they passed a law saying that they could use counselors with mental health backgrounds to help with this. Now, if the call is $300 per call, I would hope that we wouldn't take someone that, where we could, connect them to suicide hotlines for free. We wouldn't put them into a call to Oklahoma with somebody that is trained in the same thing, but we do have a suicide hotline now in Wyoming, which is not 100%, but it's underway. I would like to explore the use of what was called the Albany County Mental Health Advisory Board to see if they, if they could go on contract. I worry about, we have something called frequent flyers, which you deal with. And we may get someone that wants to make that $300 phone call every other day. So I want to make sure that when we implement this, that we do it in a way in which we're not just, we use reasonable resources before and then, have our officers trained to know which one really needs that call to a trained professional that, makes that $300 phone call for whatever time they're on the phone. I worry that if everyone takes, has a phone number on an iPad or phone or whatever, that we could be running up some pretty extensive bills when we don't have to, if it just needs, maybe someone that is a counselor in a VOA or something like that that could help. So anyway, there's a little bit of concern. I don't want to jump into this where we put down our $1,000 and then start taking on these $300 phone calls. I could foresee that we'd have 10 a day, and that would be very expensive.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, council member. That's a quote that this company gave us. My intention is to fully, hopefully, utilize the VOA and grant funding through the state. I do believe that there's some on the horizon from what I've gleaned in my travels. The VOA actually currently has 2 clinicians, and they do have 24/7 available responses, specifically for their gatekeeping program. However, to expand it at this size, and my conversations with the VOA are not unique to Albany County. It's actually a statewide program that we're hoping to implement, but that we're hoping to use Albany County as a pilot program. So I would like to use their clinicians for our pilot program. I don't know if that's possible or not. Hopefully I'll find out here in the next couple weeks. But this alternative with this company is another way of looking at the problem and maybe establishing a pilot program and going that route if the VOA is unavailable. Ultimately, we're always prudent trying to find grant funding and hopefully either a national or state resource that we can use to pull some of these clinicians in.
Thank you, Chief. Vice Mayor?
The chief has pretty much answered what I was going to say, but that, the hope would be to combine with VOA, with their current system, with the directives coming out of the legislature, and toward the provision of mental health, to combine with gatekeeping, with other services, and to expand so that it is within our community. And I just wanted to say that because of the pandemic, counseling and crisis intervention necessarily had to go telehealth. And so a good bit of research and evaluation has been done subsequently that supports the effectiveness of that and dispels the idea that it must be done in person. So, but I hear what you're saying, Councilor Shumway, and agree with you that it's something that could get quickly out of hand. But we're working with the local connections and trying to build it within our state and within our community.
Thank you, Vice Mayor.
Thank you.
Any other questions, council? I think this is, for my 2 cents, I think this is a great idea. I think keeping in mind that the cost isn't zero now, that those welfare checks and those other calls are not, that they're coming in regardless of how we decide to attend to them. So if we can be more effective on one hand, even if it costs a little more, if we're more effective by using technology and then in sort of eliminating some of the need for officers to show up so they can be doing other things that, your department is understaffed like the rest of everything at the city, it seems, but may have secondary benefits that we don't know, that we can't quite quantify at this point. So for my 2 cents, that's where I'll leave it. Council members, any other parting thoughts on that? Okay. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
Okay, council, so that wraps out the kind of focus on personnel that I had planned for. We're ready to move to the Recreation Center Fund. It's a much smaller discussion. We can be out of here probably in 15, 20 minutes. Are you comfortable moving forward?
Council, let's take 5 minutes.
Okay.
Nancy, do you know if our audio folks are back?
Oh, he's blinking on air.
Okay, I think he blinked the on air.
Yeah, he blinked it.
Hey, folks, I think we're ready to get started. City Manager?
Go ahead.
Thank you, City Clerk. Welcome back, everyone. City Manager, we are back to you to finish up the Recreation Fund.
Thank you. We will literally need not much time here. Jennifer Wade, our Administrative Services Director, is going to come up and talk to you about the financial position of this fund, and then I'll go through the very few supplemental recommendations.
Thank you, City Manager. Director Wade, welcome back.
Thank you. Good evening again, Honorable Mayor, City Councilors. The report on financial condition in the Recreation Center Fund is that revenue has now fully rebounded to pre-pandemic levels. That is a very exciting announcement, and I am so pleased with the work of Jody and her team. Really working on that revenue to get it back to that level. It certainly did not happen overnight, and it didn't happen without a lot of effort from that team. And so we're forecasting revenue from user charges to exceed $1 million in fiscal year 2023, and forecasting admissions revenue at about $900,000 for fiscal year 2024. And so that is really exceptional rebounding. As you know, the Recreation Center was hard hit by the pandemic. I know fire EMS was hard hit as well operationally, but if you think about the Recreation Center and its operations, their facility closed down. They had to partially reopen with way more staff with COVID protocols, which was more expensive, and not as many people could be there, and then people had to go through the process mentally of becoming comfortable in those spaces again. And her team really had to see that through operationally, as well as figure out how to get folks back in the door. And so really, really good work in the last few years. The next step is looking at what we can do with expenditures, because they have grown. We would expect that expenditures would grow for the rec center at this point due to deferred capital maintenance. And so with a 20-year-old facility, we are expecting it to be a little bit more expensive to maintain. Operationally, however, during the pandemic, of course, the cost of staffing went up. And as you heard, some conversation this evening, actually finding non-benefited employees to work for the wages that we're used to paying is becoming increasingly difficult. And so in this next year, with the staffing and compensation analysis, we'll really take a look at expenditures to see if there's any work we can do at the rec center operation to make that return a little bit closer to pre-pandemic levels. But all in all, very exciting news. What you will see because of the revenue performance is that we're dialing back general fund support in fiscal year 2024, down $250,000. So the general fund support transfer will adjust downward to $1 million from $1.25 million. Pre-pandemic, what we would have considered to be a normal general fund transfer would have been between $500,000 and $600,000, with maybe $100,000 of that, $150,000 of that being for capital related items. And so still being up around that $1 million mark is significant. And thankfully, as we talked about earlier, the city received additional funding from the CARES Act and some of our other pandemic-related aid that we used in order to support the Recreation Center operation to the tune of about, I believe, $2.5 million, with a $600,000 normal investment total. And so lots of good work happening in that fund from a financial position standpoint, and just a little bit more left to go in the coming year as we really analyze that full return to normal. For the revenue forecast, what you're going to see really in terms of the adjustment is a $250,000 to $1,000 increase in admissions revenue, which is what allows us to offset that general fund transfer by the same amount. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. That's great news. Yeah. Council members, any questions? Councilor Doherty.
This is probably a question for Jody, and I'm happy to do that later. But I know that there was a lot of adjusting how membership and all that kind of stuff. Do you feel like that's part of it, or is it just that people are, it's just more normal now?
Honorable Mayor, through you to Councilor Doherty, I actually believe it's a product of multiple fronts. First off, we went through and did a remodel at the Recreation Center and actually started to create more of a controlled entrance. I'll bring that up because I know I was at Whiting High School giving a presentation. One of the young men said, "Why'd you put in those dang turnstiles?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "I can't get in there for free anymore." So I think we had a significant capture of revenue when we did put in some security controls. The other point was, we did see some increase in the fees that we did last summer, and right now we're at the year, and we're starting to see that return. But really, as I've been back, I've actually gone back and been working out, even though it doesn't show. The place is busy, and it's just, I think it's just a return to normal, as Director Wade had indicated, that return to normal for the community to feel comfortable to go into that facility. I don't know how many of you attended either the Pumpkin Dunkin' event or the Luau and Laradice event, but when you've got 400 or 500 people that you get to experience those events, and then they keep coming back. And we were actually blessed with the Luau and Laradice because I-80 closed, and we picked up about 50 people that were stuck in town just from the I-80 closure, which was nice to have them in town too. But I think it's a product of everything that they've been doing, and really just a significant amount of work, as Jen said, by Jody and her staff.
Thank you, Assistant City Manager, and pass along our thanks to Jody and her staff. City Manager.
Council, I'm starting on page 114, looking at the expenditures. I wanted to touch on the very bottom of this page first, just to point out that the personnel in the Recreation Center, my laptop just died, so now I'm going to have to come up here and look along with you, Councilor Gabriel. Recreation Center staff is solid for many years at about 13 and a half full-time equivalent positions. And then moving to the next page, 115. Thank you. You can see here expenditures for this department by type. And you'll see what shouldn't be surprising, but that personnel are a significant portion, about half of all of the cost of operating the rec center. The bar chart at the bottom of this page really illustrates, I think, what Director Wade had said. If you look at fiscal 21, which was picking up a portion of calendar year 2020 and the pandemic, you can see that actual expenditure was very much down because we were not open and we were not functional. And not only were we not spending, but we also were not receiving revenue from memberships and entrance fees. Moving to page 116, there are just a couple supplemental budget adjustments recommended, the most notable of which is $15,000 for website improvements. This was recommended in the facility performance analysis that was completed for the Recreation Center, and that website presence for them is huge. They operate like a business, and marketing and promotions and easy sign up for classes and memberships through an online portal is essential to support their business model. So there is a total of $17,500 adjustment recommended, $15,000 of which is dedicated to that website presence. And I believe that is really the large part of it in terms of operating and maintenance budgets. Moving to page 117, you will see $8,750 supplemental minor issue for a broom attachment. I don't have my glasses, I can't read that very well. Thank you. And then moving to page 118, you'll see the capital project summary. And there's a $60,000 recommended adjustment for a new filter for the indoor leisure pool. And I think that dovetails on what Director Wade had mentioned. This facility is 20 years old, and we really are starting to see our maintenance costs increase to upkeep a facility that's aged like that. And Todd is all over that, so he'll talk more about it.
Honorable Mayor, I just wanted to point out that $60,000 expense, $40,000 of that is borne by the Albany County Rec Board, and $20,000 of that is borne by the city. So.
Thank you, Assistant City Manager.
Yeah, always good to be cost sharing. That's the totality of what is recommended for changes to the second budget year for the rec center. And that is what we had scheduled for your presentation tonight, Council. Next Wednesday, a week from today, we'll be in here for the second work session, and at that work session, we will be covering our enterprise or our business type funds, as Director Wade noted. We'll have Director of Public Works here and perhaps some of his staff to talk us through that. I'd like to close out tonight, if I could, by letting Director Wade counsel you a little bit on how to complete a budget amendment request if you would like to amend what is being recommended to you tonight.
Thank you, City Manager.
Good evening again for the final time. I sent you an email just maybe 15 minutes ago that contains the budget motion forms for the recommended fiscal year 2024 budget. Our motion forms are very simple. In essence, if you wish to change the budget, you'll prepare a budget motion form that is discussed and voted on at the budget special meeting on May the 23rd. So you'll need to draft a budget motion, which myself, COO Brown, City Manager Jordan are happy to help you with. I believe there's also a section maybe for recommended funding or a description, but you should find those forms very intuitive to use. So they're distributed to you this evening, and they are due by end of business on next Friday, May the 19th. And so we'll have a work session this evening, of course, one a week from now, and then you've got 2 days to get your budget motion form submitted. If you already know what you're going to propose, we would love to have them early. If you don't and you need to make your way through the entire budget work session schedule, then you have 2 days after the last one to submit your forms. I will distribute to you a summary of all the proposed motions by end of business on Tuesday, just prior to our special meeting on Wednesday. Do you have any questions about the process?
Any questions, Council? Okay. Please use the motion forms. Please. Okay, everyone. Any other comments at the end of this work session? Okay, Council, we're going to go ahead and close this work session, and we are adjourned. Thank you all.